funky little face rig. So I'll show you, I guess, like a few different ways to do things. So like goofy little eyeball controls for rotation. Ones, if you want to move them manually, you can sort of do that without it going crazy and like exploding your scene. And I'll show you sort of 3 different ways to set up like eyebrow, or what am I saying, eyelid controls. These 2, particularly on the little circle one, are not the most elegant that have ever existed, but they are, you know, relatively straightforward to set up. This shutter one was also really easy to set up, and I think it's pretty nice. You'll notice, like, as I'm not actually doing any kind of scaling on these, they just sort of translate down in a very systematic way that looks like it would be kind of, you know, realistic. So I'll show you how to set this all up, and you'll also notice that it works, like, you know, if this is on a rig, which presumably if you're doing some kind of like facial whatever, it's going to be on a rig. All of these things work just as well when rotated as they do flat. So, let us begin. Mwahaha. I literally just made the same, here is the same head. I've just not done anything on this to set it up. So the first thing I want to do, you'll notice my pivot is down here, just sort of like recreating where probably a pivot would be in the neck. I'll show you guys the eyebrows. It's like the sort of most fairly straightforward, I think, thing to set up. So this one, I'm going to, again, there's sort of 2 different ways that I usually use to do this. And you could, if you didn't want to have, you know, individual eyebrow controls, for this particular version I'm about to show you, you could totally just tack these little attributes onto, you know, the head control or whatever, so there's fewer controls over your face, less to click on. I'm just sort of doing this, I guess, to keep things clear. So what I'm going to do is just go to Edit, Add Attribute, and do brow up, down. And this one, I'm not going to put any kind of min and max in. I can do that later if I want to. Brow, rotate. And then if you have watched the rest of the rigging videos, I'm pretty much just going to go through and hook up everything in the channel box. So translate Z is what I'm shooting for. So I'm going to go Windows, General Editors, Connection Editor, load that as the driver, load this as the driven, grab brow up, down, and find translate, and I said, I think translate Z. So you will notice that when I scrub through this, and I'm working upside down on my myosine, so my stuff is backwards, but you notice that this is now hooked up to the translate of this. Pretty much the same deal for rotate. You just want to go through, and I do remember this is actually rotate Y. So hook up brow rotate to rotate Y, and then you should have this. Which is pretty much what you want. So that's like really all the eyebrow control that you need. The only other thing that you can do to this if you want, so like if you knew you never wanted your eyebrow to like, you know, clip aggressively through your eyeball, what you can do is sort of look at this and be, okay, like what is 1.3 is where I want to stop that. So just go into Edit Attribute with the brow up down selected, grab brow up down, and you want to do has, in this case, again, because I've set it up backwards, this is actually the maximum, not the minimum, which is weird and counterintuitive, but you're basically setting either a max or a min for this value, so that if you go down and you try to, you know, enter like a value of 2, it will not do it. So what this gives you is you can move this up as far as you want, but you'll never clip it through the eye, so it just makes it a little bit easier to scrub through things. You could do the same thing with the rotate if you wanted to, but in the case of the rotate, I think it makes sense, like, you know, if it's up here and you want to do something like, oh, my eyebrow is like flipping crazily, or something like that, you can do that. Also, fun tidbit, so someone asked me the other day how I was doing a thing, and I realized it's just like a hotkey that I use all the time. But if you can scrub through values by clicking the text next to the attribute, coming into your viewport, and then middle mouse button clicking and dragging. You'll notice that like as soon as I press the middle mouse button, the cursor changes to this little like arrow thing, and then you can scrub back and forth between values. Rather convenient sometimes. But anywho, that's the first type of eyebrow. The next type of eyebrow is going to be a little bit different. I'm not actually going to make any extra attributes. What I'm going to do is use the motion of the controller itself to drive the eyebrow motion. You can kind of see on this one, I've just gone through and locked a crap ton of values, and that's pretty much actually how I'm going to control this. So I want to, in this case, only leave unlocked, translate Z, and rotate Y. So I'm going to come over and do the same thing. Just grab my attributes. I'll do scale as well. Right click and do lock selected. And then you should only be able, like if I try to move this sideways, can't do it. up and down, totally fine. And same thing for rotation. Basically just ensures you don't accidentally move things in a way you don't want to. What I'm going to do to make this actually follow the eyebrow is first, I did realize the location of this pivot is really stupid, so I'm going to just really quickly center this in the eyebrow. Wherever you have the pivot is where the eyebrow is going to rotate from. So, grab controller, grab eyebrow, constrain, and I'm just going to do a parent constraint. And now this should take the eyebrow with it. So another sort of easy rotation control if you prefer having sort of the visual controller there to manually manipulate. Other thing you can do, so like this one, you'll notice I set some values so I can't shift it into the eyebrow, like I'm trying to move it down and I can't. So you can set limits on the rotation and stuff of these basic attributes, more or less the same way you can do what we just did over here where you like set a minimum and maximum. Just a slightly different process. So what you want to do, go into your attribute editor, find, usually it's going to be like this brow square, or like it's not the shape node, it's the node for the actual object. And if you scroll down, I have it open on my computer, but you see this limit information here. So what you want to do is basically if I'm trying to modify translate, look at translate. And I'm just going to go ahead and move this down as far as I want this. So in this case, I'm going to say probably like 1.39. And again, my stuff is not, kind of backwards. Normally this would be the minimum, but mine is going to be the maximum. So I'm just going to go ahead and this little button will transfer whatever value here into this max number. If I check this, you'll notice that I am unable to move this down any further. I can do the same thing over here where I just sort of move this up to -4.3 apparently. And then again, check this minimum button. And then no matter how far up I try to drag this, it will only go in these predefined set of areas. So this can also be really good if you're, working on like something with an FK control and you want to prevent clipping of your model. You can set these limits if you want to sort of help prevent that. And basically you would want to do the same thing with rotation. In this case, I'm just going to be kind of lazy and just check the default -45 and 45. So that, pretty much whenever I try to rotate this, it's only going to go 45 degrees or 45 degrees. So that's pretty much the most basic sort of eyebrow setup that you can do. And again, you can hook these attributes up more or less anywhere. Not so much for this one because this is relying on the physical controller to move things, but this can be hooked up very easily, like, here again, and just delete this entire controller. All right, that's eyebrows. I'll show you the two different types of eyeballs. So the first one that we have is, just gonna hide this lower eyelid. Actually, I'm just gonna move this lower eyelid slightly down so it's not clipping and just sort of call that good for a second. So what we want to do is, again, in this particular version with the green eyelid, you can do on the head controller and just omit this controller completely. Same actually for the purple, but what I'm going to do is just go in and do add attribute again, and I will do upper rotate, and again, not leaving any particular minimum maximum in that, and making sure I'm using a float. Go to add, lower rotate, add, lower, down, up. And this one I do actually want a minimum and maximum in. I just sort of know that. I only want it to go between 0 and 1, but I can always come back and add that later if I realize that after the fact. So, we have these lovely values. What I'm going to do is once again open up my connection editor, which is possibly my favorite thing to use when rigging for everything, because I'm a spaz. Go down to upper rotate and hook that up to the rotate Y of this. And once again, this should pretty much control, that whole eyelid. And I do kind of like the effect if I wanted to do, maybe like a really goofy effect. I could do this sort of like washing machine effect, so I'm not going to cap this with a minimum and maximum. I'll just sort of like pay attention to the values I'm doing. And while I'm here, I'm actually also going to hook that up to the lower rotate. Same thing, rotate Y for that as well. So we should have two sort of jiggly eyebrows. You can see, again, this one's sort of moving. And this actually maybe, possibly, kind of could be an interesting way to like make some kind of weird aperture. Like you could do something, I'll show you how to set this up in a minute, but you could do something like that where you maybe have like a bunch of sort of rotating pies that come out and make like a sort of weird sideways blink or something like that. Kind of either way. So the next thing we're going to do is use... There's two ways to do this. In this version, I actually used a set-driven key to... what am I saying? I used a blend shape to set this up. In this one, I think I'm actually just going to use a set-driven key for the scale values, because it's really all I changed in this. So what I'm going to do is go into Windows, key in your animation menu, set-driven key, set. I'm going to load the control as a driver. And then in this particular instance, I'm going to... great. Okay, actually, okay. So I had two thoughts. Let me duplicate this really quick. So there's, like I kind of mentioned, there's two ways to do this. One is to use a blend shape, which is basically going to be you sort of shrinking this down and making a version of this shape that you want to morph into. So in this case, you can see I've really only modified scale values here. And when you do this, it's going to actually leave the pivot in the center of the eye, which in this case I think is preferable. There are ways around doing that. They just involve adding an extra group. So I do, in my next video, I go over adding blend shapes to like a weird attribute or aperture eye. So I'm going to actually leave this for now and do blend shapes in that video. I'll show you the sort of like, I guess, simpler way maybe to set this up with a group. So I'm just going to go ahead and zero this out. And I am going to put this cylinder in a group and take the pivot of that group and move it down to the bottom of the eye. And again, pivot location is in this case important, so wherever I scale this from is where the pivot is going to be. So it's just convenient to have the pivot at the bottom of the eye because it sort of keeps the eyelid where you need it. And you'll notice that doing this, the pivot of the object remains sort of on this vertice here. So in this case, I've actually realized I've set things up a little bit backwards. And what I'm going to do is grab the... Actually, have I even hooked that? Oh, interesting. Alright, so somehow the rotate that I hooked up for this lower eyelid has detached itself, possibly because I've added a group, but I don't really know. Maybe I undid it. But somehow that's not a thing anymore, which is actually convenient because that's what I want. Excuse me. So what I'm going to do is go through, and instead of making the group pivot at the bottom of the eye, I'm going to snap that to the center of the eyelid itself, and then I'm going to take the pivot of the eyelid and move that down. So what this should give us is kind of the same setup as before. So if I want to rotate the eye through the center of this eyeball, I'm going to rotate the group. And if I want to mess with the scale of the object, I'm going to modify the object itself. So what I'm going to do is just create a little set-driven key for this. So when low down up is at 0, I would like, it was scale X and scale Z, I would like those values to be whatever they are here. So just select all the values that you want to key and go ahead and hit key. And then what you want to do is set another keyframe. So when down up is at 1, so I like 1 as being sort of like closed. I don't know, it's really up to you. It doesn't really make a practical difference for what you're doing. I just sort of like to be consistent across my stuff. So then change the values and go ahead, do key again. And what you should have now is, if you scrub through this, did I hook this up incorrectly? Maybe? I feel like I've been doing that a lot today. What? Dang it, I killed... Wait, no, I did want scale. I actually wanted scale for once, and I never want scale. What is this? Load driven? Whoops! I was using the wrong object. Herpaderp. I have no idea what I just attached that to. That's disturbing. Alright, so redo this again. When low down up is at 0, I'm going to grab this, scale it down to whatever random size that I want. Hooray. and I want scale X and scale Z, and I will key that. Go back into this. Oh, I attached, that's weird. That's very awkward. So I actually realized I attached the controller scale to the controller itself, which is dumb. Anyway. Like, what am I selecting right now? Alright, so again, pretty much the same thing I just did, except hopefully this time it'll actually work. Yay! So you have this really awkward blinking motion. And one thing that I would like to point out about this, if I haven't already said it, is that this is not an ideal way to do things if you have textures on your object, because you're scaling it. It's going to sort of stretch and deform with your object. So it's not necessarily the most ideal thing. If you're just using flat textures like this, it works pretty nicely. But again, if you had any kind of textures on this, it would look a little bit weird excuse me, with this setup. But you'll notice now we can sort of open this eyelid, and if we want, rotate that around. Oh yeah, I didn't rehook that up. Okay. Rehooking that up. So this eyebrow, or this eye, is going to be hooked up. If we go into our connection editor again, shockingly, my favorite thing ever, and scroll down to lower rotate, and this time we want, you want the group for that pivot, because that's where the pivot is in the center of this eyeball. Since it's round, that makes sense for it to be sort of in the center. So grab the rotate and just hook it up to rotate Y. And then we should be good to actually rotate this. And you can see the blinking sort of works the same no matter what position the eyelid is at. So that is eyelid type 1, and you can see you can also make Pac-Man like this if you want to. Alright. Why am I saving this? So eyelid type 2 is basically going to be another set-driven key. So this one is going to be not really fancier or harder to set up, but I'm going to go with a set-driven key because it allows me to really easily sort of predefine this slightly more complex motion once. It involves 3 things moving in a specific way, so it's going to be easier, again, to set this up with a few keys and a set-driven key once than have to, anytime I move this eyelid down, pay attention to like what this piece and this piece and this piece are doing. So what you want to do, go in and just add another attribute, and do, let's see, lid, up, down. Really doesn't super matter what you call it. And I'll set this one with a minimum of 0 and a maximum of 1. Again, just sort of like a little toggle. It's easy to be like, if eyeball is at, or if this attribute is at 0, the eyelid is closed. If it's at 1, it's open, or like however you want to set that up. I just think it's easier to use sort of 0 through 1 values. So, set driven key again, controller, load your driven, and for this one, you're going to grab all of your objects and load all of those as driven. And in this case, I will be using translate Z. Alright, so what I'm going to do is say that at when, did I grab the wrong controller? Load driver? I did. Alright, so when lid up down is at 0, the translate Z of all of these is sort of at their default position, in this case just 0, whatever. You can set this up backwards, it really doesn't matter. Go ahead and key that, and you'll notice that I have all of these selected, so it should go through for each of these objects and hook up that translate Z value at the same time. Very convenient, saves a lot of time. So what I'm going to do, I did some janky math, and I'm like, well, I need to sort of have 3 separate sections of this, where like, only this is moving, that's part 1, only this is moving, part 2, and this moves down, and that's part 3. So what I'm going to do, instead of just going straight to 1, I'm going to go to 0.33 for this value, and I'm just going to grab this and move it down as much as I want. I'm also going to push it physically down, on the translate Y again, just because I think it just kind of looks a little bit nicer when I do that, I think. And I'm also going to go ahead and select the translate Y as well as translate Z. Go ahead for all of these and just go ahead and key that. So what we should have if we scrub between 0 and 0.3 is only this eyebrow is moving. If we go any higher than 0.33, you'll notice that like nothing happens because we haven't set that up yet. So it's just like, all right, well, 0.3 is the last thing we got for information, so we're just going to kind of keep using that. I did also realize that at up down 0, I was not translating the translate Y of anything, so I do need to go back and sort of set that back to what it should be. Let's go ahead and sort of rekey that. And then go back in and do the same thing at a value of around 0.66. And again, it doesn't, I just think this is going to give you sort of like even motion. If you scrub between these, it doesn't, if you had, 5 eyelids, you could do in increments of like 0.2 or something like that. It doesn't super crazy matter all that much. Go ahead and key that, and then just go back up to a value of 1, and grab all of these, and just move all of them down. And this is like, you want to make sure that either you've designed your robot so that you can not have the eyeballs clipping, or just move this down until it pops out of the skin, shift it back a little bit, and then go ahead and key those. So hopefully, if I've set this up correctly, it should give you pretty much that nice sort of like shuttered motion that you have last time, where this guy doesn't start moving until this one is also moving. Now there is a little bit, it's not totally perfect, where you can see, I'm gonna go on a limb and say this just because of how Maya interpolates its values for things, where you'll notice like right in the transition, like sometimes the first green lid that was moving is kind of moving maybe at a different speed than the second one. Again, I think that's just sort of because of the hyper graph and like how Maya does like the bell curves for the interpolating of things. But you could always sort of play with that if it really bothered you. So that is pretty much all the eyelids. The only thing left is how to sort of set this up so that it follows the head. Excuse me. I would also note that this would also work if you had, pretty much either of these principles for any of these would work for like hatch mouths if you needed to animate like a Pez dispenser or an elevator rising or I don't know, some weird thing like that. That would work. You basically just want to hook up, whatever attribute, and then you can set limits and stuff like that so that your model doesn't explode. Excuse me. I do not know why I'm coughing so much today. All right. So goal of this is if move head, rest of things go with. So I'm just going to go ahead and normally I don't parent constrain a bunch of stuff. I didn't feel like setting up joints in this. So, what? Oh, whoops. For some reason. Okay, so I've accidentally locked attributes on the head, which is not letting me add, what? Which is not letting me add a constraint, so I just went ahead and unlocked those attributes and try to constrain again. Hooray. All right. And I'm just going to constrain pretty much any hard piece of geometry to the head. And actually, you don't even need to do that. So I have these circle eyeballs and stuff in groups. So what I'm going to do is actually just grab the controller, grab the group for circle, grab the controller. I'll do the brows at the same time. What the heck? And wherever the square eye is, I will do that. So what this should give us is all the why is this floating outside? Yes, because okay. So this actually makes sense. So what we have is all the geometry will follow this thing, the weird head controller I've set up. The controllers aren't following, but you'll notice that they still do exactly the same thing that they were doing previously. Same thing with all the brow rotates and all that stuff. The only one that's not following is this very, very thick eyebrow, and that is because it is parent constrained to this control. So it's going to follow this control, and not the head, just because of the order of how Maya sort of calculates stuff. So what we want to do, I mean, it looks honestly really stupid to have all of the controls not follow the head, so I'm just going to grab all of them and just sort of parent that to the head control. And that should, this eyebrow should now follow the head. The controllers follow the head, which is always preferable. Yeah. That was weird. And then again, everything should work the same way it does before. One interesting thing to note, so I'm going to just like rotate this at a weird 45-degree angle to make a point. If I grab this controller, remember this is the one where I've locked values and set limits for things. If I move this straight up on the Y, it's only going to translate on the local Z because of the fact that, I've locked all of the other values. So it is kind of nice for ease of use. You could also just go in to your move tool, and instead of setting this to world space, do object space, and then the axis will be a little bit more obvious. I mean, this would be my preference, but it's kind of interesting to note that it does behave differently. And same thing for rotate. So like this is very much using world orientation. So like me rotating this is only rotating Y, which normally would sort of do a bunch of things. But yeah, that's pretty much like a weird janky iRig. The next video in the playlist, if you're watching the playlist, is like how to do aperture eyes with blended shapes. It's a fairly, little bit of a rambly video, but fairly straightforward process to set up. It involves just like a lot of set driven keys and, you know, some basic modeling stuff. So yeah.